I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist. And I am the environmentalist. I've been working on the intersection of environment and race and place for 4 decades. And if we look at environmental justice in the era of climate change and COVID, we can see that, first of all, communities of color are disproportionately, in the US, are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution. And if we look at COVID 19, it's like a heat seeking missile that's targeting the most vulnerable population in terms of health, but also targeting the most environmentally sensitive population. African Americans and Latinos are 3 times as likely to become infected as their white neighbors, and nearly twice as likely to die from COVID 19. And if you look at that connection between pollution and COVID, a recent Harvard study showed that high levels of pollution, particularly particulate matter, will increase the likelihood of dying by 15% if you're in those high polluted areas. There's also a racial footprint when it comes to climate and COVID. When we talk about racial redlining, that is discrimination in the location of people being able to buy houses or not. Racial redlining practice against people of color a century ago in the 20s and 30s is showing up in terms of urban heat islands. Red line neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were discriminated against are 5 to 13 degrees hotter. Redlining is also showing up in terms of COVID 19 dangers and segregated neighborhoods of color. Long before Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, people of color knew and learned the hard way that waiting for the government can be hazardous to your health. The government has always been slow to respond to disasters when it involves poor people, working class people, and people of color. Climate change will exacerbate these inequalities and vulnerabilities of already marginalized populations. If we look at the, the impact of climate change, we'll have more bad air days. And the fact that more bad air days means more unhealthy people and death. And if you look at in the US, people of color and poor people are more likely to live in um, cities and metropolitan areas that are in violation of the Clean Air Act. And if you look at this whole notion of um, health equity and racial justice, an EPA study, 2018 EPA study showed that in 46 states, people of color live with more air pollution than whites. America is segregated along racial lines, even in 2020, and so is pollution. People of color breathe 38% more polluted air than whites. And if we talk about this whole question of breathe at your own risk, uh, we're saying that, uh, for example, air pollution causes over 200,000 early deaths each year, and a disproportionate share of those premature deaths are poor people and people of color. African Americans are almost 3 times more likely than whites to die from asthma. And if you look at black children, for example, black children are 10 times more likely to die from asthma than white children. And when we talk about climate and vulnerability, who gets left behind, the Hurricane Katrina was a textbook case of environmental racism and climate racism when we talk about injustice. If we talk about climate change will hit the poor and people of color in the southern United States hardest. If we do nothing in terms of climate policy in the US, the country will lose a 6% drop in its GDP. But the southern part of the US will lose a 20% drop. The South is already the poorest part of the country and the country that's least likely to move forward with progressive energy, climate, and civil rights provisions. Climate change will widen the economic gap. Disasters, resources, recovery dollars, generally the path of that it follows is money follows money, money follows power, and money follows whites. After major severe weather events that were tracked over the last couple of decades, looking at $10 billion damages, white communities, after recovery dollars were spent, on average, were $126,000 better off in wealth after the recovery dollars went in. However, communities of color, on average, lost about $29,000. Now, this is significant in that Black people and Latinos only wealth is only 10% of that of white wealth. Climate action plans must address equity, racial justice, and economic justice. Addressing equity is a prerequisite for achieving climate resilience. Now, with FEMA's COVID-19 response, new guidance saying that communities, if there's a disaster, your first line is to shelter in place, stay put. Now, for those communities that got 15 inches of water in their houses, and they're in a one level, not 15 inches, you get 6 feet, 7 feet of water, then you're going to drown if you only got one level. And so many communities right now are having to deal with COVID, sheltering in place because of disaster shelters. It's the last resort because of COVID. You can't shelter in place. So those communities on the front line for flooding, hurricanes, and we're dealing with communities like that right now in Lake Charles and Mossville, in Port Arthur, Texas, in Mobile right now with Sally, in Pensacola with Wedgwood. These are communities that we've worked with for the last 25, 30 years. COVID-19 has made it much more stringent, and the FEMA policies has inadvertently created additional layer of waiting to get rescued or drowning or being flooded out. Those are realities.
This is the largest fire season in California record, and the largest, most severe fire season that we know of, even before documentary records, in the sense that in the past there were years with frequent burning done by the indigenous peoples to manage the landscape, but they were not high severity fires like this that are having huge impact on ecosystems as well as on the communities that they threaten. And not just directly affecting people who live in and around the fires themselves, but millions more who are impacted by air pollution that they cause. On the other hand, they're not unanticipated. So for the last 12 to 15 years, I have led the climate assessment activities for the state of California, specifically for wildfire. There have been 4 impact assessments conducted for the state, and we're currently in the early stages of the 5th assessment now. And part of what we do for these assessments is we simulate fires in the state on a grid over the whole state, month by month, for 150 years for a wide range of climate scenarios, but also scenarios around, say, population growth, development footprint, fuels management, and a variety of other topics. So, for example, the 4th climate assessment was published in 2018. We actually simulated fires, 100 million maps of fires around the state, statewide, as part of that. So looking at individual extreme events and seasons. And we projected that this kind of thing would be happening with increasing frequency. By mid-century, the climate conditions are such that 30 years from now, this would be potentially a very common event. So this is something that is deeply concerning when you look at the impacts economically, but also psychologically and in public health. This is not a world we want to be in where this is regularly occurring in the state. Climate change is definitely the primary driver here. It's true that there were many decades of fire suppression and land management that contributed to increased fuel loads, particularly on federal lands in our national forests. And that legacy of past management has resulted in a fuel situation there that is amplifying the effects of climate change. So it's the interaction between these other things we've done in the past and climate change that's contributing to some of the fire severity and frequency and size. But there are fires burning in the state and a lot of other ecosystems that are not as directly affected by past management in ways that would make them burn more severely today than they would have, 100 or 500 years ago. And yet they are burning more also. And this is true around the Western United States. So climate change is not a one-off thing that happens and then you're done and now you have a new normal. There will be no new normal. So the changes that are in our climate system that are driving our experience like we're having this year in our very active fire season are something that are going to continue to change at an increasing pace for the rest of the lifespan of everyone alive today in the state and around the planet. What we can do is take a two-pronged approach, multi-pronged approach. On the one hand, we need to do everything we can to slow down the pace of climate change by getting our emissions to zero and then actually getting to negative emissions. We have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But then we also need to start managing our landscape in ways more intensively, in ways that will reduce our vulnerability and reduce the impact of the fires that we do have. And similarly, we need to start thinking more carefully about our communities, their spatial footprint, how we develop in the future, where we put new housing. We have a severe housing crisis in the state already. If we use it as an opportunity to infill in existing communities where we can create more housing options that are safer and don't increase the risk and the difficulty of managing these fires in the wildland-urban interface, we'd be much better off than if we allow more sprawling development that puts more and more people at risk and makes it more and more difficult to manage these fire seasons going into the future. The lands are federal lands and should be primarily the responsibility of the federal government and not the state government. Beyond that, you don't do fuels management in chaparral or wet forests that don't burn more than once a century. Grasslands, what you do is you create buffers around communities, and most of our fuels work has been going to that already. So this is not primarily a fuels management problem, and it's not primarily the responsibility of the state of California rather than the federal government. This is a pretty arid climate, a Mediterranean climate. We have a long summer, dry season, and the peak of our fire season, it usually occurs in the fall when the dry conditions extend into the part of the year where the winds start to pick up as the season changes. And then typically we have a rainstorm that will put out fires and raise the relative humidity, wet the fuels, and basically bring an end to the season, the fire season. You might still get some small fires, but you wouldn't get a really big conflagration. And you guys may have noticed that has been failing occasionally in recent years. So we had the Thomas fire a few years ago in Ventura. That was the first mega fire in December in the state history. And we didn't have enough precipitation all the way into the middle of December to prevent an event like that. And it was at the time the largest fire in state history. So that is part of the story here for people really to focus on, is that the same things that are driving our increased fire severity and size and frequency in the state are also the things that are affecting our water supplies. Another way that climate change is impacting fire and our water supply is just increased temperatures means more evaporation. So as we warm up the temperatures and we're not really changing precipitation that much overall, that means that if you think about the moisture in the state, both for drinking water and for irrigation use and for wetting down the fuels. You think of it like water going into a bathtub from the rain, right? And where does it come out? It comes out as runoff or evaporation. So, and finally, there's a third effect, which is really that warmer temperatures mean that a greater proportion of the precipitation we do get comes as rain and less as snow. And the snow is what carries over some of the winter precipitation into the late spring and early summer. We don't have, if you go onto the Colorado River, they have some really huge dams, and those dams can hold back collectively, the two biggest dams, 2 years of the flow of the river, and all of them together about 4 years of the average flow of the river. In California, it's a different situation. We have a bunch of smaller dams on smaller rivers and tributaries, and a lot of our storage is really in the snow. So we manage those dams in California for flood control earlier in the season, and then as we get later into the spring, we manage them for water supply. And because we're getting more rain and less snow, and then warmer temperatures in the spring mean that the snow we do have melts out sooner, we're getting that snow melt runoff pulse earlier and earlier in the year. And now we have a conflict between how we want to manage those dams. We want to manage them for flood control at the same time that we're also trying to manage them for water supply. So we don't have the redundancy in storage in California that allows us to make up for this shift in the timing of the spring snowmelt. And we're losing that sort of natural storage of the snowpack in the mountains. And that is also extending our fire season, because now our mountain forests will dry out sooner in the year. And that can move the fire season back much earlier at those elevations. And we have a water storage problem as well. So all of this goes together. If you look at that really extreme drought we had in the previous decade, that was the strongest, most intense drought in California in at least 1,200 years. And it was greatly exacerbated by climate change, both through its effects on temperature and on snow, amount of snow and timing of snow melt, and then the variability of precipitation. All those things were basically enhanced impacts on this drought because of climate change. And that just underscores the insecurity of our water supply going forward, but it also has had a tremendous impact on the wildfires that we've been experiencing in the state since that time, because a lot of vegetation was killed. And so we have this standing dead vegetation, as well as the new stuff that's growing up and drying out in our dry season. And so some of the fires that we're experiencing this year, for example, are greatly enhanced. So they're much more severe because of these accumulated dead fuels from the drought and the related beetle infestations. It's that one party and one administration is completely divorced from science. They're not interested in hearing about the scientific conclusions about fire, about climate change, about land management. And the other is still traditionally a typical sort of party of good governance that is willing to listen to the science. And science, as well as our past experiences as individuals and as communities, is a primary way of understanding reality in the world. Right? So if you're not engaged with the science, you're not engaged with reality. And especially in a situation where reality is changing in unprecedented ways since our civilization arose, you cannot be successful in the long term without being engaged with the science. And that is the advantage of a Biden administration or any Democratic administration at the moment, is that they're committed to working with the scientific community and using science in designing policies to be as effective as possible.
It's the January 2020, which was declared by NOAA in USA the hottest January anytime in the last 140 years. January 2020 was also the most abrupt January in the history of humanity, because from that month, we started a catastrophic journey on this planet into unknown with, I must say, shamefully unprepared health systems. I mean, shameful because the countries that boasted or still boast of nuclear weapons and star wars in order to defend their countries and borders and the people are miserably and desolately brought to knees and led to the cliff to hang on. And this tiny coronavirus, from which they cannot protect their own population, leave alone the border and the countries. And these countries are fighting a war that cannot kill the invisible enemy of few hundred microns. This tiny micron size enemy, having played a guerrilla warfare with us, now is showing further potential to mutate with cruel speed that points to the fatal future that looks dark, almost like a sixth extinction. Indeed, we have been talking about it, about the sixth extinction, for now few decades. But now it does not look far and further. The world is in reality at the introspection of two disasters, health and climate change. The second disaster is not been abrupt till now, but getting more and more close to it because its intensity and annoyingly frequent occurrence is really dreadful. And it has a potential to even become rapid runaway and may result into another sort of pandemic. And that's why in the video I called it Climate 30. Why 30? Because by 2030, if you don't take action, and we have not been really taking any action, there are some sporadic piecemeal action points. And if you don't do that in a collective way, in 2030, we are in for the disaster as painted by IPCC, for which I worked. That's why Climate 30. Nature in this case is giving really a warning. For COVID-19, there was no warning. So thank you to nature for giving that warning. And we now know that early action is critical to face the planetary scale catastrophe. And temperature rise due to the climate change is likely to add to this different cruel dimension of this coronavirus. And we already know or heard now that this coronavirus can mutate. And we don't know due to the higher temperature, it will mutate faster. There has to be people coming together to negotiate and tackle what is called as this coronavirus or COVID-19. People are unable to come together. Every country has its own strategy. Not only that, every president has his own strategy, which may differ from countries, people to other and the president. But if at all people come together, thankfully under the United Nations umbrella, then we have to use this common but differentiated responsibility principle to make sure that the poor people get all the health-related equipment, the vaccines, the treatment to the poor countries along with their own people. Why? Because those rich countries have got rich because they used their imperial power and took all the natural resources from the poor countries. That's why they got rich. I mean, we all know that from the history books, and nobody can probably refute it. And that's why it was agreed in case of climate change treaty that the developed countries will help the developing countries. The same thing is required to be done within the country and globally for the health related issues. I stop there. There are many other things to be talked about this common but differentiated responsibility. But I think that principle had worked very successfully in some of the global environmental treaties like Ozone Treaty. And there is no reason why it should not work now. Just at the end, I want to say that at present, United Nations General Assembly is debating on their annual event about the challenges that are in front of the world. Everybody talks about their commitment to the climate change. Some people talk about their commitment to the democracy. Nobody has talked about coming together and finding and seeking the solutions for a common cause of saving the humanity from COVID-19. And United Nations also is failing to use its convening power to get the people around and make that happen. There is an urgency, there is a sense of urgency. And now this is not a time to say that we are committed. We should say that we have made a plan and started it. And if at all it has to be by 2030, need to be 40 to 50%, we already achieved 25%. Somebody has to say that, and the next plan for another 25% ready. And the optimism is some of those people are doing it. They are not doing it country-wise or the nation-wise, but they are doing it from their company or business-wise, or they are doing it for the state-wise. And if I'm correct, probably some of the states have already the plans saying that even if USA goes out of the Paris Climate Agreement, we will still